"Stop me when it's too much," the lonely rancher murmured to the virgin bride he won by fate. The ranch lay far from the nearest town, stretched across rolling hills and open fields. Its wooden fences, weathered by years of sun and rain, marked the boundaries of land that had belonged to the family for generations. The rancher, a tall man with broad shoulders and a quiet demeanor, moved slowly across the property as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Every morning began the same way. He fed the animals, checked the fences, and made sure that everything on the ranch was in order. His days were long and his work was tiring, but it was a life he had grown used to. He had lived alone for many years. After losing his parents when he was still young, the ranch had become both his home and his only companion. The isolation had shaped him in ways that people who lived in towns could not understand. He was strong and capable, but there was a quiet sadness in his eyes, a loneliness that no amount of work could fill. The neighbors rarely visited, and letters from relatives came only on special occasions, leaving him to the company of the animals that roamed his land. Horses, cows, and dogs were more than just animals to him. They were the friends who listened without judgment, who shared his quiet days without complaint. Despite the isolation, the rancher had built a life of routine. He woke up before dawn, his body moving automatically through tasks that had become second nature. The smell of hay, the soft lowing of cows, and the gentle nuzzle of horses were constants that comforted him, even on the hardest days. But there were moments late at night when he would sit alone on the porch and let the silence settle around him. The stars stretched endlessly above the ranch, beautiful yet indifferent. And in those moments, he would feel the weight of his solitude more heavily than at any other time. People in the nearby village often whispered about him. "He's a good man," they would say, "but he keeps to himself too much." Children would watch from a distance as he rode his horse across the fields, their curiosity mingled with a little fear. He didn't mind. He had grown used to being an observer of life rather than an active participant in it. The loneliness had become a familiar companion, one he knew how to live with, even if it left an emptiness in his heart that no amount of work could fill. One morning, while repairing a fence near the edge of the property, he noticed a rider approaching from the distance. It was unusual for anyone to come this far without warning, and he instinctively tightened his grip on the hammer in his hand. As the rider drew closer, he realized it was a messenger from his distant relatives. The news was unexpected and unusual. An arrangement had been made for him to be married. The rancher paused, unsure how to react. Marriage had not been something he had considered in years. His life had been full of solitude, routine, and work, and the thought of sharing it with another person felt foreign. Yet, the messenger's words carried a sense of urgency and hope. Fate, it seemed, was stepping into the quiet life he had built so carefully. In the days that followed, he found himself thinking more about the possibility of companionship. He had never been unkind to others, but he had also never allowed himself to become close to anyone. His heart, hardened by years of solitude, had grown cautious. The thought of sharing his life with a stranger was both frightening and oddly comforting. He walked through his fields, feeling the wind against his face and the sun warming his back, and wondered what it would be like to have someone there with him. Not just a presence, but someone to talk to, someone to share the small joys and struggles of daily life. Preparations for the bride's arrival began quietly. The rancher cleaned the house more thoroughly than he ever had before, dusting corners that had long been ignored and polishing the wooden floors until they gleamed. He repaired the small guest room at the end of the hall, placing fresh linens on the bed and arranging simple flowers on the windowsill. Even in his solitude, he took care with every detail, as if his efforts could somehow make the stranger feel welcomed in a world that was so different from the towns and villages she had known. When the day of her arrival finally came, the rancher felt a strange mix of anticipation and nervousness. He had imagined many scenarios in his mind, but nothing could have truly prepared him for the reality of seeing her for the first time. She was shy, quiet, and unsure of the vast space around her. Her eyes widened at the endless fields and the animals that roamed freely. The rancher, seeing her hesitancy, stepped forward with a gentle nod, offering a smile that had been rare in his life for many years. He realized that this meeting, simple as it seemed, was the start of a new chapter he had not expected to write. The first moments together were awkward, filled with silence and tentative gestures. She had come from a life very different from the ranch, and he had never learned how to explain the world he lived in. Yet, as they shared their first meal and walked together through the fields, there was a quiet understanding that began to grow. Both were strangers to this new reality, and both carried their own fears and uncertainties. But in the midst of these differences, there was also curiosity that with patience could turn into connection. Days passed, and the rancher began to notice the small ways she adapted to life on the ranch. She helped feed the animals, learned to navigate the large property, and began to understand the rhythm of work that dictated his days. There were moments of laughter when she stumbled while carrying a bucket of water, or when a curious horse nudged her shoulder. There were also quiet evenings when they sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the land at dusk, and both felt the weight of unspoken emotions. The rancher, who had spent so many years in silence, began to sense the presence of someone who might understand him in ways he had never known. Even as he adjusted to the idea of marriage, the rancher could not deny the lingering fear within him. He had spent so long alone that the thought of sharing his life, his routines, and his heart with another person felt like a leap into the unknown. Yet, alongside the fear was a strange hope. Perhaps this marriage, arranged by fate, could fill the quiet spaces of his life with warmth and companionship. Perhaps the years of solitude had prepared him to truly appreciate what it meant to have someone by his side. And so, the rancher continued his days, moving through his chores with quiet diligence, while also keeping an eye on the young bride who was slowly becoming part of his world. He did not yet know how their relationship would unfold, but for the first time in many years, he felt a sense of possibility. The loneliness that had defined his life for so long was beginning to loosen its hold, replaced by a cautious curiosity about the life that lay ahead. And in the stillness of the ranch, beneath the endless sky and among the animals that had been his companions for so long, the rancher began to imagine a future in which he was no longer alone. The morning of her arrival dawned clear and bright, the sunlight spilling over the rolling hills and casting long shadows across the ranch. The young bride had traveled a long distance, her journey filled with uncertainty and quiet anticipation. She had been told she was to marry a man she had never met, in a place she had never been. The idea frightened her, yet there was also a strange sense of curiosity, a hope that perhaps life on the ranch could offer her a home and safety she had never known before. She clutched her small bag tightly, her knuckles white, as the carriage rolled down the dusty road toward the ranch. When she first saw the expanse of land, the animals roaming freely, and the tall, silent figure of her husband-to-be standing near the stable, she froze for a moment. The ranch seemed enormous, almost endless, and the quiet around it was overwhelming. There were no neighbors nearby, no busy streets, only the sound of the wind rustling through the grass and the distant lowing of cows. Her heart pounded, both with fear and with awe. The rancher noticed her hesitation and took a cautious step forward. His face, though serious, held a softness that had been rare in his years of solitude. "Welcome," he said quietly, his voice calm but unsure. "I'm glad you're here," she nodded, unsure what else to say. Words felt heavy and unnecessary at that moment. He offered her a small smile, and though it was brief, it brought a tiny comfort to her racing heart. The two of them stood in silence for a few moments, each observing the other. She noticed the rancher's strong hands, calloused from years of hard work, and the way he carried himself with careful precision. He noticed her wide, curious eyes, the way she seemed to take in every detail of the ranch as if memorizing it all at once. The first hours were filled with introductions to the house and the routines of the ranch. The rancher showed her the kitchen, where meals were prepared, the barn, where the animals waited, and the small guest room that had been readied for her. She marveled at the simplicity of life here, so different from the town she had left behind. Every object seemed purposeful, every space arranged with care. He spoke little, but his explanations were precise, his tone patient. She began to understand that this was a man who valued order and responsibility, a man who had built his life carefully around the work he loved. In the afternoon, the rancher led her to the stables to meet the horses. The animals, sensing a new presence, shifted nervously. One horse stepped forward, sniffing her hand cautiously, and she laughed softly, a sound that seemed to surprise even herself. The rancher watched, his heart softening at the sight. He had not expected laughter in the quiet of his ranch, and yet it felt like sunlight breaking through a clouded sky. He spoke to her gently, explaining how to care for the animals, how to brush their coats, and how to feed them properly. She listened carefully, her movements tentative at first, but growing more confident with each step. Evening came, bringing a cooler breeze and the soft glow of the setting sun. They returned to the porch and sat together in silence, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. She felt a strange mix of emotions, fear, excitement, and a growing sense of trust. She realized that though this man had seemed intimidating at first, he was patient, careful not to overwhelm her with too much expectation too soon. He noticed the way her hands trembled slightly and the way her eyes widened at unfamiliar sights, and he felt a protective instinct stir within him. Over the next few days, life on the ranch settled into a delicate rhythm. The bride began to learn the chores, feeding the animals, carrying water, tending to the garden. She stumbled occasionally, spilling water or dropping a bucket, and the rancher would correct her gently, never raising his voice. She admired his patience, though at times she felt self-conscious about her mistakes. Slowly, the fear that had gripped her at first began to fade, replaced by a growing determination to adapt to this new life. She understood that if she were to survive here, she would need to learn quickly, and she was willing to try. Their conversations were brief at first, often awkward, but they grew longer and more natural over time. He would ask about her journey, her family, and her dreams, listening intently as she spoke. She, in turn, asked about his life on the ranch, the animals he cared for, and the routines that filled his days. In these exchanges, a fragile trust began to form. She realized that he, too, carried loneliness and perhaps even a longing for connection, though he had learned to hide it behind quiet strength and self-reliance. One afternoon, while walking through the fields together, she stumbled on a loose stone and almost fell. He caught her arm instinctively, steadying her before she could lose her balance. For a moment their eyes met, and she saw something in his gaze that she had not expected, a gentle concern, a depth of care that made her heart flutter. She felt both comforted and nervous, unsure how to respond. He quickly looked away, focusing instead on the path ahead, as if embarrassed by the moment. She smiled softly to herself, feeling a warmth in her chest that she had never known before. Night brought new challenges. The house was quiet, the animals settled for the night, and the vast silence of the ranch pressed around them. She found herself lying awake, thinking of her new life, wondering if she would ever truly feel at home here. The rancher, too, felt the weight of solitude in those late hours, though now there was the added presence of another person in his life. He paced the rooms quietly, checking the animals one last time, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. He realized that this young bride, so timid and fragile, had become a part of his world in a way that was both comforting and frightening. Days turned into weeks, and the bride's confidence grew. She learned to ride a horse, to mend fences, and to help in the fields. The rancher watched her with a mix of pride and admiration, recognizing her determination and resilience. At the same time, he felt a growing responsibility to protect her, to ensure that she felt safe and respected in this unfamiliar life. Their interactions became more natural, less formal, and small moments of humor began to appear: spilled water, playful teasing, and shared glances that spoke volumes without words. Through it all, there was an unspoken tension, a mutual awareness of the emotional distance that still existed between them. They were learning to navigate a new relationship, each step careful and deliberate. He would sometimes murmur quietly when he felt overwhelmed by his emotions, "Stop me when it's too much," signaling his fear of overstepping boundaries or causing her discomfort. She, in turn, began to understand the depth of his loneliness and the care he took in every action, realizing that beneath the stoic exterior was a man who had spent years protecting his heart from pain. One afternoon, while sitting by the small pond near the edge of the property, they shared their first extended conversation. She spoke of her childhood, of the family she had lost, and of the dreams she had once held. He listened quietly, offering words of encouragement and understanding. She felt a connection growing, a sense that perhaps they could learn to support each other in ways neither had expected. The pond reflected the clear blue sky above, and in that quiet moment, surrounded by the beauty of the ranch, a seed of hope was planted in both their hearts. As the days continued, the bride and the rancher began to find comfort in each other's presence. The fear that had marked her arrival slowly faded, replaced by curiosity, trust, and a tentative sense of belonging. The rancher, too, felt the stirrings of emotion he had long kept buried, realizing that companionship could bring both joy and challenge. Life on the ranch, once predictable and solitary, was beginning to change, shaped by the presence of a new person who was learning to adapt, to care, and to share in the rhythm of this world. Evenings were the most challenging, filled with quiet reflection. They would sit on the porch, watching the sun sink below the horizon, the sky turning shades of pink, purple, and gold. In those moments, words were unnecessary. The bride would rest her hands on her lap, and the rancher would sit beside her, both listening to the soft sounds of the land. It was a peaceful silence, a time for both to gather their thoughts and emotions, understanding that the journey ahead would be long but filled with possibility. Through these early days, the young bride began to realize that life on the ranch was more than hard work. It was a chance for growth, for connection, and for discovery. She learned to appreciate the quiet moments, the beauty of open fields, and the strength required to care for animals and land alike. And the rancher, observing her courage and determination, began to see that perhaps he had underestimated the power of companionship, the way it could soften loneliness and bring life to the quiet corners of his heart. Life on the ranch, which had begun with curiosity and careful adjustment, soon entered a phase of small challenges and quiet tension. The young bride, though gradually gaining confidence in her daily tasks, sometimes felt overwhelmed by the physical demands and unfamiliar routines of ranch life. She had grown up in a more sheltered environment, where life moved at a slower pace and responsibilities were lighter. Here, every day required effort, patience, and endurance. Carrying buckets of water, feeding the animals, and helping mend fences became exhausting tasks, yet she persisted, motivated by a sense of duty and an unspoken desire to earn the rancher's respect. The rancher, for his part, was not unkind, but he struggled to communicate his expectations clearly. He had spent years working alone, accustomed to relying only on himself, and the thought of explaining even the simplest routines felt awkward. Sometimes his instructions came across as sharp or impatient, though he never intended to hurt her. She would occasionally flinch at his tone, sensing the weight of his authority, while he remained unaware of the small cracks of fear that appeared in her expression. These moments of misunderstanding created a delicate tension between them, as both were learning how to navigate the unfamiliar territory of shared life. One afternoon, while repairing a section of the barn roof, the bride accidentally dropped a heavy tool. It clattered to the wooden floor below, startling the horses and drawing the rancher's attention. He hurried over, his brows furrowed in concern. "Careful," he said firmly, though his voice carried more worry than anger. She nodded, feeling both embarrassed and anxious. She wanted to prove herself, to show that she could handle life on the ranch, but the fear of failure and the pressure to meet his expectations weighed heavily on her. The rancher noticed her hesitation and softened his tone. "It's all right. Just take your time." "You'll learn," he said gently, offering a small smile. That brief exchange sparked a small connection, a moment of reassurance that reminded them both of the need for patience. As the days went on, their routines began to overlap more frequently. The rancher would rise early to check the animals and complete chores, and she would follow, helping wherever she could. Sometimes, she would move too slowly or make mistakes that caused minor setbacks. Other times, she would surprise him with her determination and ability to adapt quickly. Each small success and failure became a lesson for both of them, not only about the work of ranching, but also about understanding and adjusting to each other's presence. Slowly, a pattern of trust and cooperation began to form, even amidst the occasional frustration. Despite these growing bonds, the emotional tension between them remained. Both were aware of the delicate nature of their relationship, understanding that trust and comfort could not be rushed. The rancher, in particular, struggled with his own fears. He had lived a life of solitude for so long that the idea of opening his heart fully to another person felt risky. He worried about overwhelming her, about asking too much, or expecting more than she could give. At times, he would catch himself staring at her quietly, feeling a mixture of admiration, protectiveness, and uncertainty. In moments of vulnerability, he would murmur under his breath, "Stop me when it's too much," acknowledging both his emotions and the unspoken boundaries between them. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat together on the porch, sharing a simple meal. The sun had set, leaving a soft glow of twilight across the fields. The bride spoke about her memories of home, her family, and the dreams she once held, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. The rancher listened attentively, offering small nods and gentle words of encouragement. She realized that beneath his reserved exterior was a man capable of deep empathy and understanding. The rancher, in turn, was struck by her resilience and willingness to adapt, recognizing that she carried her own fears and insecurities with quiet strength. These shared moments of vulnerability, though brief, began to break down the emotional walls they had built around themselves. However, the challenges of ranch life could not be ignored. One morning, while tending to the cattle in the far fields, a sudden storm approached. Dark clouds rolled across the sky and wind whipped through the grass. The bride, unfamiliar with such conditions, hesitated, unsure how to protect herself or the animals. The rancher moved quickly, guiding her and the cattle to a sheltered area, his calm yet commanding presence providing reassurance. Once they were safe, he looked at her with concern. "You need to trust yourself," he said quietly, "and trust me too. We'll get through this together." She nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude and relief. In that moment, she realized that trust was not only about following instructions, it was about believing in the other person's care and judgment, even when fear threatened to take over. As the weeks passed, small moments of humor and tenderness began to appear. She would stumble while carrying water or trip over a loose board, and he would suppress a laugh, offering help without condescension. She would tease him about his seriousness, and he would respond with a small smile or a quiet chuckle, revealing glimpses of warmth he rarely displayed. These exchanges, simple as they were, became the glue that held their growing bond together. They learned to balance patience with laughter, discipline with kindness, and work with moments of shared joy. Yet, the emotional complexity of their relationship continued to test them. The rancher, accustomed to solitude, found it difficult to express his feelings directly. His gestures of care, preparing her meals, fixing broken equipment, or guiding her through tasks, were often understated, leaving her unsure of his true intentions. She, on the other hand, struggled to interpret his reserved nature, occasionally misreading his silence as disinterest or criticism. These misunderstandings led to small arguments, moments of tension that reminded them both of the delicate process of building trust. But even in these conflicts, there was an underlying respect and concern that prevented them from drifting too far apart. One afternoon, while sitting by the edge of the pasture, they encountered a moment that would test their patience and understanding. A young calf had wandered off, and both rushed to guide it back to the herd. She tried to help, but her movements were clumsy, and the calf became frightened, running in circles. The rancher acted quickly, his hands steady and his voice calm, finally bringing the calf back safely. She looked at him, her chest heaving with a mixture of fear, relief, and admiration. He looked back at her, his expression softening. "It's all right," he said. "We'll learn together. You're doing fine." That simple reassurance, spoken with sincerity, strengthened their connection in a way that words alone could not. Even as they faced these small trials, their emotional awareness of each other grew. She began to notice the subtle ways he showed care, checking her hands for scratches, ensuring she had enough water, and observing her carefully during difficult tasks. He, in turn, recognized her courage and persistence, seeing the determination she brought to every challenge. They were learning that love and trust were built not only through grand gestures, but also through everyday acts of attention, patience, and support. Nighttime remained a period of reflection and quiet emotion. After long days, they would often sit on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear sky above the ranch. In those moments, silence was comforting rather than oppressive. They would speak occasionally, sharing thoughts about the day, small fears, or fleeting dreams. These conversations, gentle and deliberate, allowed them to explore the emotional depths of their relationship at a pace that felt safe. They were learning to listen not only to words, but to gestures, expressions, and the unspoken language of care. Gradually, the rancher began to understand that his feelings for the bride were more complex than he had anticipated. He admired her resilience, her willingness to adapt, and the kindness she extended to both him and the animals. At the same time, he feared the vulnerability that came with emotional attachment, worried that he might unintentionally hurt her or overstep boundaries. The phrase he murmured in private, "Stop me when it's too much," became both a warning and a promise, a recognition of his own limitations and a pledge to respect hers. The bride, too, began to feel a growing attachment. Though she had arrived timid and uncertain, she was learning to navigate the ranch, to anticipate the rancher's moods, and to contribute meaningfully to daily life. She realized that trust was not a single act but a continuous process, built over days and weeks of shared experience. Her admiration for him grew alongside her understanding of the difficulties he had faced in his solitary life. She saw a man who had built a life of strength and resilience, yet who carried an emotional depth that he seldom revealed. By the end of this period, the rancher and the bride had developed a fragile but meaningful bond. It was not yet love in its fullest sense, but it was the foundation of something enduring: trust, respect, and shared understanding. They had faced small challenges, navigated misunderstandings, and discovered moments of laughter and tenderness. Life on the ranch, though still demanding, had begun to take on a new dimension, shaped by the presence of another person who was learning to care and be cared for in return. The stage was now set for deeper emotional growth. Both were aware of the complexities and challenges that lay ahead, yet they faced the future with a cautious optimism. They had learned that patience, empathy, and communication were essential to building a relationship that could withstand the pressures of life on the ranch. And in the quiet moments, beneath the wide-open sky and amidst the animals and fields that had defined their days, a sense of possibility began to bloom, a sense that, despite their differences and fears, they could find companionship, understanding, and perhaps even love. Days on. The ranch began to change. What had once been a quiet, predictable routine now held a new energy, one born of the growing connection between the rancher and his bride. The work remained demanding, but their shared experiences had begun to weave a bond that neither could ignore. They started to anticipate each other's actions, learning the subtle cues that guided the flow of life on the ranch. She would bring him water before he even asked, and he would leave small notes or gestures that showed he was thinking of her well-being. The small, thoughtful acts became a language of care, slowly turning their mutual respect into genuine companionship. One morning, they rose early to check on the cattle before the sun had fully risen. Mist hung low over the fields, and the air smelled of damp earth and hay. She followed him across the pasture, struggling to keep pace but determined not to falter. The rancher slowed when he noticed her hesitation, offering a hand to help her climb over a fence. "It's all right," he said softly. "Take your time." She smiled, feeling a warmth that went beyond the rising sun. In those small gestures, she realized that he was not only guiding her through the physical challenges of ranch life, but also helping her find confidence in herself. The days were long and filled with tasks, but together, they discovered moments of quiet joy. They would ride horses across the rolling hills, the wind whipping through their hair as laughter spilled naturally between them. Sometimes they would sit by the pond, tossing stones into the water and competing to see who could make the biggest splash. The simplicity of these moments contrasted sharply with the demands of their daily work, yet they became the glue that bound their hearts. Each shared laugh and glance was a step toward intimacy, and with each passing day, the rancher felt his walls slowly crumbling, allowing him to experience emotions he had long buried. Even the animals seemed to sense the shift in their relationship. The horses would nuzzle them both in greeting, and the cattle would follow their movements more calmly, as if acknowledging the harmony now present in the ranch's human inhabitants. She noticed the rancher's softer expression when he watched her interact with the animals, a tenderness in his gaze that he seldom directed at anyone. And he, in turn, observed the way she had grown, how she handled the animals confidently, carried out chores with care, and moved through the land with a sense of belonging that had been absent when she first arrived. It was clear that their lives, once separate and solitary, were now intertwining in quiet, meaningful ways. Despite the growing closeness, both were still cautious with their emotions. The rancher, aware of the young bride's innocence and past vulnerabilities, did not want to push her too quickly. He remembered his own fears and insecurities and approached their relationship carefully, mindful of boundaries and her comfort. She, too, was learning the delicate balance of trust, understanding that his reserved nature did not signify indifference. Small misunderstandings would still occur, a misplaced word or a moment of silence, but they had begun to recognize that communication, patience, and empathy were the keys to navigating these challenges. One afternoon, while they were repairing a fence together, a sudden gust of wind knocked over a stack of tools. The bride instinctively jumped back, startled, and he quickly moved to steady her. Their eyes met, and in that moment words were unnecessary. The rancher simply reached out and gently took her hand, guiding her to safety. Her heart raced, not from fear but from the closeness of the moment. He felt a quiet thrill, a mixture of protectiveness and affection that he had never allowed himself to acknowledge before. It was moments like this that deepened the connection between them, creating a bond built on trust, care, and unspoken understanding. As the seasons slowly shifted, the rancher and the bride began to share more of their personal stories. Around the dinner table, they would speak of childhood memories, of past hardships and joys, and of dreams for the future. She told him about her family, the struggles she had faced growing up without parents, and the moments of kindness from strangers that had shaped her resilience. He shared stories of his parents, the lessons they had taught him, and the years of solitude that had defined his adulthood. Through these conversations, they discovered a deep empathy for each other, realizing that despite their different backgrounds, both had endured loss, loneliness, and uncertainty. Evenings became a time for quiet reflection and emotional connection. They would sit on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky, and speak softly of hopes and fears. Sometimes, silence would fall, comfortable and reassuring rather than awkward. She learned to read his expressions, noticing the subtle signs of stress, fatigue, or joy, and he began to appreciate the grace and thoughtfulness she brought to every action. Together, they discovered that intimacy was not only about grand gestures, but also about shared experiences, small kindnesses, and mutual understanding. One particular day marked a turning point. The bride had been learning to ride the rancher's fastest horse, a spirited stallion that often tested her balance and courage. The rancher stayed close, guiding her with careful instructions and steady hands. At first she was nervous, unsure if she could control the powerful animal. But with his patient encouragement, she gained confidence, riding freely across the pasture. When she returned, laughing and flushed with excitement, he felt an unfamiliar sense of pride and joy. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with admiration. She smiled, realizing that he was not only teaching her practical skills, but also encouraging her to believe in herself. It was a moment of triumph, shared between them, that deepened their bond in ways neither could have anticipated. The couple also began to rely on each other during the more difficult aspects of ranch life. When a storm threatened the fields, they worked together to secure the animals and protect the crops. When a fence broke or a sick animal needed attention, they collaborated efficiently, combining their strengths and compensating for each other's weaknesses. In these moments, the bride realized that the rancher's stoic exterior hid a profound capacity for teamwork, trust, and care. He, in turn, saw her growing strength, adaptability, and dedication, recognizing that she had become an indispensable part of his life. Amidst the labor and challenges, they discovered a growing emotional intimacy. Small touches, a hand on the shoulder, a guiding hand during chores, a reassuring look, became more frequent and meaningful. Laughter, once rare, now flowed easily between them, creating warmth that softened the edges of the ranch's solitude. Even the rancher's murmured warning, "Stop me when it's too much," had evolved into a symbol of their mutual awareness, a recognition of boundaries paired with the willingness to explore emotional closeness. The phrase was no longer a caution born of fear, but a gesture of care, showing that he respected her comfort while inviting trust. The villagers who occasionally visited began to notice the change as well. Whispers turned to admiration as they observed a couple who, though different in temperament and background, had found harmony in their shared life. She moved with confidence, her laughter ringing across the fields, while he displayed a gentleness previously hidden beneath years of solitude. Together, they represented not only resilience and adaptability, but also the quiet power of connection, showing that even the loneliest lives could be transformed by patience, care, and understanding. By the end of this period, the couple had grown inseparable in many ways. The ranch was no longer a place of isolation, but of life, shared responsibility, and emotional warmth. They had faced challenges together, learned from mistakes, and discovered moments of joy that strengthened their bond. The bride had become more confident, skilled, and attuned to the rhythms of the ranch, while the rancher had begun to embrace vulnerability, allowing himself to feel emotions he had long suppressed. Together, they had created a partnership rooted in trust, care, and growing affection, laying the groundwork for a deeper connection that promised to endure. As night fell, the rancher and bride would sit quietly, side by side, looking out over the fields bathed in moonlight. The world around them was peaceful, filled with the soft sounds of animals settling for the night and the gentle rustle of wind through the grass. In these moments, they no longer felt the weight of loneliness that had once defined their lives. Instead, they experienced a quiet fulfillment, a sense that they were no longer alone in facing the demands of the ranch or the challenges of life. Their connection, forged through shared labor, laughter, and understanding, had transformed the ranch into a home where love, respect, and companionship thrived. The months had passed, and life on the ranch had grown richer, warmer, and more complete. What had once been a quiet, lonely place was now filled with the presence of two hearts learning to move together in harmony. The rancher, once solitary and reserved, had discovered a companionship he had long thought impossible. The bride, who had arrived timid and unsure, had blossomed into a confident, capable partner who could share both the work and the joys of ranch life. Their bond, forged through shared effort, patience, and understanding, had grown into something deep and enduring. One morning, as the sun rose over the rolling fields, the couple set out together to check on the livestock. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of dew and earth. The bride moved with ease and confidence, her hands steady and sure as she tended to the animals. The rancher watched her from a short distance, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. She had come so far from the shy, hesitant girl who had first arrived months ago. He marveled at her resilience, her courage, and the kindness she brought to every task. In that moment, he realized that he no longer felt the emptiness that had defined so many of his years. As they worked together, small gestures of care and affection had become a natural part of their daily lives. He would steady her as she climbed over a fence, and she would hand him tools before he even asked for them. Laughter now flowed easily between them, ringing out across the fields like music. Even during difficult tasks, mending fences in the heat of the day or leading the herd during a sudden storm, they worked in harmony, anticipating each other's needs and supporting one another without a word. The ranch was no longer simply a place of labor. It had become a shared world of trust, respect, and emotional intimacy. Evenings were the most precious moments of all. They would sit together on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. Sometimes they would speak of dreams for the future. Sometimes they would simply sit in companionable silence, listening to the soft rustle of wind through the grass or the distant lowing of cattle. The rancher, who had once spent long nights alone, now felt the comfort of another presence beside him. The bride, too, found peace in these quiet moments, feeling a sense of belonging she had never known before. The loneliness that had shadowed both of their lives seemed to have melted away, replaced by warmth, connection, and hope. There were moments of reflection, too, as they considered how far they had come. The rancher often thought about the years of solitude he had endured and the walls he had built around his heart. He realized that those years had taught him resilience and self-reliance, but they had also left him unprepared for the depth of emotion that companionship could bring. Now, with the bride beside him, he learned that vulnerability could be a strength, that sharing life with someone did not diminish him but made him stronger. She had helped him see the world with new eyes, finding joy in small moments and beauty in the everyday routines of ranch life. The bride, reflecting on her own journey, recognized her growth as well. She had arrived scared, shy, and uncertain, but the ranch had taught her independence, resilience, and the value of patience. More importantly, she had learned to trust another person completely, to rely on him and know that he would support and protect her. She understood that the bond they shared was not simply about companionship. It was about mutual respect, understanding, and love that had grown slowly, carefully, and deliberately. In the quiet of the night, she would watch the stars, feeling grateful for the chance that fate had brought her to this place, and this man. Life continued on the ranch with the same steady rhythm of work and care, but now each day was infused with joy and meaning. They faced challenges together, from unpredictable weather to the occasional sick animal, and each difficulty only strengthened their partnership. She had learned to ride the rancher's fastest horses with confidence, to tend the garden, and to handle tools and equipment she had once feared. He, in turn, had become more patient, communicative, and open to emotional connection, learning to express care and affection in ways that were subtle yet powerful. Together, they created a life in which both could thrive. One afternoon, the rancher suggested a small adventure. They would ride across the hills to a hidden stream he had discovered years ago, a place where the water was clear and cool, and the surroundings were peaceful. The bride's eyes lit up with excitement, her smile radiant. As they rode side by side, the wind blowing through their hair, they laughed freely, the sound carrying across the open fields. At the stream, they dismounted and waded into the shallow water, enjoying the refreshing coolness on their tired feet. The moment felt like a celebration, not just of the beauty of nature, but of the bond they had built, the journey they had shared, and the love that had quietly grown between them. Even small daily routines became moments of connection. He would brew her morning tea just the way she liked it, and she would prepare meals with care, knowing which dishes he preferred. They shared stories from their pasts, discussed hopes for the future, and sometimes simply sat together, enjoying the quiet companionship of one another. The phrase he had once murmured, "Stop me when it's too much," had lost its cautionary tone and now felt like a promise, a recognition of their emotional closeness and respect for each other's comfort. They no longer feared emotional intimacy. Instead, they embraced it with trust and mutual understanding. The animals, too, seemed to sense the harmony between them. Horses would nuzzle them both in greeting, dogs would playfully follow their steps, and even the cows moved calmly under their guidance. The ranch was no longer merely a workplace. It had become a home, a sanctuary filled with laughter, care, and love. Visitors from the nearby village would sometimes remark on the change they observed, the way the couple moved in sync, the warmth of their interactions, and the clear bond that had formed. Their story became a quiet inspiration, a testament to patience, understanding, and the transformative power of companionship. As the months passed, the couple began to envision a future together. They spoke of improvements they could make to the ranch, of gardens to plant, and animals to raise. They dreamed of shared celebrations, of creating memories that would last a lifetime. The rancher, once solitary and withdrawn, realized that life with the bride was not only fulfilling but deeply meaningful. She, in turn, felt a sense of purpose, belonging, and joy that she had never imagined possible. Together, they had turned the ranch into more than a home. It was now a living testament to their shared journey, resilience, and love. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of pink and gold, the couple sat on the porch in companionable silence. The rancher reached for her hand, and she responded instinctively, their fingers intertwining naturally. No words were needed. The connection between them was clear, strong, and unspoken. They had faced challenges, navigated misunderstandings, and grown together in ways neither could have predicted. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the beauty of the land and the peaceful sounds of the ranch, they understood that they had found something rare and enduring, a true partnership built on trust, respect, and love. The journey had not been easy. There had been moments of fear, misunderstanding, and emotional uncertainty. But through patience, empathy, and shared effort, they had created a life that was richer and more meaningful than either could have imagined alone. The rancher, once defined by loneliness, now felt the warmth of companionship. The bride, once uncertain and timid, now stood confidently beside him, capable, resilient, and deeply connected. Together, they had transformed not only the ranch but also themselves, finding fulfillment in a life shared with understanding and care. As night fully settled over the ranch, the stars twinkling in the clear sky, the couple remained on the porch, hands intertwined. The world around them was peaceful, filled with the quiet sounds of animals and the gentle whisper of wind through the grass. They were no longer strangers brought together by fate. They were partners, friends, and companions who had chosen to trust, care for, and love one another. Their journey, once filled with uncertainty, had led to a life of harmony, warmth, and hope, a life that promised happiness for the days and years to come. The rancher finally spoke, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "I never thought I could feel this way," he said. "I never thought life could change so completely." She looked at him, her eyes shining, and smiled. "Neither did I," she replied, "but now I can't imagine it any other way." In those words, they acknowledged the journey they had taken together, the loneliness, the challenges, the moments of doubt, and the small victories that had led them to this point. It was a quiet celebration of life, love, and the future they would build together. The ranch, once a place of solitude and quiet labor, had become a home filled with laughter, trust, and companionship. The fields, the animals, and the work that had once defined their days now also carried the warmth of shared experiences and emotional connection. They had created something lasting, a life that was no longer defined by circumstance or fate alone, but by choice, care, and love. And as they sat together beneath the vast night sky, the rancher and the bride knew that they had found what they had long sought. Not only each other, but a life filled with meaning, hope, and enduring joy.